When I was growing up, the attic terrified me far more than the basement ever could. I could never quite explain it. Most people tend to fear basements. The darkness below, the damp underground feeling. But for me, it was always what was above that got under my skin. If I had to point to a reason, I'd say it was because our attic wasn't what you'd typically imagine. It wasn't the usual cramped, dusty crawl space where you had to hunch over just to move around. Ours was different. It was surprisingly tall, built in a way that let you stand fully upright without any problem. You might assume that would make it feel more comfortable, more usable, like any other room in the house. But my parents never treated it that way. To them, it was nothing more than a glorified storage room, nothing else. And thinking back on it now, they avoided it whenever they possibly could. What made it even stranger was the layout. The space was broken up by irregular beams of uneven thickness, scattered with no real pattern, along with small shifts in floor level that made it feel like a disorganized maze. No matter where you stood, you could never see the attic from one end to the other. There was always something blocking your line of sight, and the floor was genuinely dangerous. My dad used to joke that one of us would eventually slip on one of the exposed joists, crash through the insulation, and punch a hole straight through the ceiling below. It wasn't that funny when you were a kid who actually had to go up there. That maze-like quality was the heart of it for me. I hated not being able to see the whole space at once. Every single time I went up there, I was convinced someone was hiding just out of sight, tucked behind one of the beams, waiting. It was an irrational fear, I knew that even then. But knowing something is irrational doesn't make it go away. What I'm about to tell you happened so long ago that most of my memories from that stretch of childhood have faded. But this one hasn't. It stayed sharp and clear, like a thorn lodged into what was otherwise a pretty good childhood. It happened during the week. I know because I had school that day. I was somewhere in middle school, maybe 12 or 13. I woke up one morning and noticed my feet were dirty. Not just a little dusty, but genuinely grimy. The bottoms were gray, and there was a fine layer of grit worked in between my toes that I couldn't explain. I sat on the edge of my bed just staring at them, trying to piece together what had happened. I hadn't been outside the night before. I hadn't done anything unusual. I'd simply gone to sleep and woken up like that. Being a kid, I didn't overthink it. I washed my feet, went to school, and moved on. But then things started building. A few days later, I found a small cardboard box sitting in my room, the kind filled with old photographs that my parents kept stored away in the attic. I had zero memory of bringing it downstairs. When I asked my mom about it, she assumed I'd been rummaging around up there for some reason. I told her I hadn't. She didn't seem particularly worried about it. She just took the box back upstairs, and that was the end of it, at least for her. Then it happened again. One morning I woke up to find an old brass lamp sitting on my desk. Ugly thing. I vaguely recognized it from the attic. This time I was absolutely certain I hadn't brought it down myself. You don't carry a lamp through your house in the middle of the night without remembering it. But there it was, sitting on my desk like it had always been there. That's when the pieces clicked. The dirty feet, the box of photographs, the lamp. I wasn't just sleepwalking, I was sleepwalking to the attic. The realization didn't frighten me immediately, but it settled over me like something cold and uncomfortable. The thought that I was unconsciously navigating that maze of beams and uneven flooring in total darkness, with absolutely no awareness of what I was doing, was deeply unsettling. I told my parents. They reacted exactly as you'd expect. They said sleepwalking was completely normal, that plenty of kids went through it, and that I'd almost certainly grow out of it. They weren't cruel about it, but they weren't particularly alarmed either. To them, it was just one of those things. To me, it was something else entirely. After that, I started dreading bedtime. I'd lie awake for hours fighting sleep, terrified of what my body might do once my mind finally gave out. But you can't fight sleep forever. Eventually, it always wins. So every morning became a ritual. The first thing I'd do was check my feet. Clean feet meant a good night. Dirty feet meant I'd been up there again. Most mornings they were clean, but those few times they weren't were enough to keep the dread alive and growing. The worst part was the complete absence of memory. For all I knew, I was spending more time in the attic each night than I was in my own bed. I had no way of knowing what I was doing up there, what I was touching, where I was going. That loss of control over my own body was a different kind of fear than anything I'd experienced before. It was slow and creeping, and it never went away. But nothing compares to what happened next. I woke up one night, only it wasn't morning. It was still completely dark. It took me a few seconds to fully register where I was, and when I did, my stomach dropped. I wasn't in my bed, I wasn't even lying down. I was standing upright in complete and total darkness, and I had no idea where in the house I was. My brain scrambled to catch up, and then it hit me all at once. I was in the attic. The fear that came over me was overwhelming. I could barely breathe. I was standing in the attic in the middle of the night in pitch-black darkness. I couldn't see anything, not a single beam, not a single box, not the hatch, nothing. Just absolute impenetrable black stretching in every direction. And to make it worse, I had no sense of where in the attic I was standing. I stayed frozen for what felt like forever. I knew the layout of the space, but only loosely and only from memory in the daylight. Moving through it blind was almost unthinkable. The beams were everywhere. The floor was uneven and treacherous. One wrong step and I could seriously hurt myself. But I couldn't just stand there in the dark indefinitely either. So I started moving, slowly, painfully, one careful inch at a time. I was crying before I even realized it. Silent tears just flooding down my face. I felt like if I made any real noise, something was going to come for me. Because that was the other thing. The thing I can't explain even now. I didn't feel alone up there. I don't know where that feeling came from, but it was absolute. There was something else in that attic with me, somewhere further back in the dark. And then I heard it. A soft thud from somewhere behind me. It sounded exactly like a footstep or like someone shifting their weight on the old floorboards. I kept moving toward where I thought the hatch was, and I heard it again. And then a third time. Each time it seemed to come from a slightly different position. Whatever was up there wasn't staying still. I can't tell you how long it took me to find the hatch. It felt like an eternity. But I eventually found it, got it open, and climbed down. I went straight to my parents' room, and by the time I got there, I wasn't even trying to hold it together anymore. I was fully sobbing. I told them everything, how I'd woken up in the dark, how I'd had to feel my way back to the hatch completely blind, and I told them about the sounds, that there had been something else up there with me and that I was sure of it. My dad didn't jump out of bed. Neither of them took it quite the way I'd hoped. My mom hugged me and told me sleepwalking could be frightening, but that it wasn't dangerous. My dad offered to put a lock on the attic hatch, which I immediately said yes to. But I pressed them to at least go up and check, and my dad eventually agreed. Watching him climb that ladder was one of the worst moments of my life. A part of me genuinely believed he wasn't coming back down. But less than 2 minutes later, he was already descending. He told me there was nothing up there. He told me to go back to sleep. So I did. But lying in my bed afterward was the worst night I have ever had. After that night, the sleepwalking stopped. I don't know why, and I'm honestly not sure what I would have done if it had continued. But even now, years later, I've never fully accepted the sleepwalking explanation. I know it's the most logical one. Sleepwalking is real, it's documented, there's nothing supernatural about it. I understand all of that. But there's something I can't let go of. The fact that I always ended up in the same place, only ever the attic. Never anywhere else in the entire house. The fact that I was apparently capable of moving through that obstacle course of beams and uneven flooring in complete darkness, without once hurting myself. And that night, standing there awake and aware in the pitch black, the sounds I heard. I still believe there was something else up there with me, I genuinely do. What it was, I have no idea. My parents have never given me a satisfying answer, even now. Every time I bring it up, they give me the same calm, dismissive response. And honestly, the way they avoid it, the way they seem almost unwilling to think about it, doesn't make any more sense to me than the rest of it. I doubt I'll ever get the answer I'm looking for. This happened when I was 14 or 15. My family lived in an old house that had been passed down through generations. My dad grew up there and his parents had grown up there before him. I don't live there anymore, but what I'm about to describe still crosses my mind from time to time, even after all these years. Like most old houses, it had an attic. It was essentially a graveyard for everything nobody wanted to deal with directly. Worn-out furniture, boxes of miscellaneous junk, and Christmas decorations. That last category was really the only reason anyone ever went up there. Once a year, just before the holidays, someone would climb up and haul everything down. Then once more after the season ended to put it all back. 2 visits a year maybe, and that was it. This particular story happened around Christmas, though the holiday itself has almost nothing to do with what unfolded. That year, my dad decided I was finally old enough to retrieve the decorations on my own. He gave me the full rundown. Which boxes to grab, something about the lights being stored separately near the back wall, various other details I was supposed to keep in mind. I nodded along the entire time like I was absorbing every word. I wasn't. My mind was somewhere else entirely, drifting through whatever a teenager thinks about when a parent is talking. By the time he finished and sent me upstairs, I had retained essentially nothing he'd said. I climbed the ladder, pulled the little chain to switch on the light, and looked around. It immediately struck me that I genuinely couldn't remember the last time I'd been up there. But that thought was quickly replaced by a more pressing one. I had absolutely no idea what my dad had actually told me to get. Not a single specific detail had stuck, and going back downstairs to ask him to repeat himself was simply not an option. My dad had a particular way about him when it came to that. If you made him say something twice, he'd get genuinely irritated about it, and that was a headache I wasn't willing to invite. So I did what any teenager in that situation would do. I started opening random boxes that looked like they might plausibly contain Christmas decorations. I moved things around, shifted piles, dug through containers that turned out to be completely wrong. It took roughly 20 minutes of disorganized searching before I finally tracked down the right stuff. At that point, the attic was a total mess. Everything displaced, nothing where it had originally been. I made 4 or 5 trips up and down the ladder hauling decorations to the living room, and once I was finished, I went back up one last time to survey the damage and figure out what reorganizing was going to be required. That's when I noticed it. Tucked into one of the back corners, partially hidden behind the clutter I'd shifted around during my search, was a box I hadn't come across before. It stood out immediately. It wasn't the typical flimsy cardboard you'd expect to find in an attic. It was black and it looked solid and durable, like a document box or one of those fireproof storage containers. But despite how sturdy it appeared, there was something about it that looked older than everything else up there. Older in a way that was hard to pin down but impossible to ignore. Being a curious teenager, I opened it without a second thought. Inside were papers, dozens and dozens of them, an almost alarming quantity. There were notebooks, loose individual pages, hand-drawn maps, and even what appeared to be a few pages of sheet music. But the one thing every single item had in common was that they were all completely covered in handwriting. Every available surface, every margin, every blank space had been filled in. The maps had handwriting on them. The notebooks were packed front to back. Even the sheet music had notes scrawled across it in the same hand. The writing was difficult to make out at first. The lettering was unusual, the style unfamiliar enough that my eyes needed time to adjust to its rhythm. But the more I read, the more I was able to follow it. None of the pages were dated, but they appeared to be arranged in some kind of chronological order. The older entries stacked near the top, the more recent ones buried deeper toward the bottom. I told myself I wasn't going back downstairs until I had read through all of it. The earliest entries were unremarkable. Observations about the weather, notes about household tasks, brief passing thoughts about the day. It read like a scattered, disorganized diary, and it quickly became clear that whoever had written it was someone who had once lived in that very house. I kept reading, expecting more of the same. What came next was not more of the same. Gradually, the tone of the writing began to shift. The handwriting itself became slightly more chaotic and harder to follow, which was the first sign that something had changed in the writer. But that was nothing compared to what the actual content revealed. Whoever had written these pages had become completely, utterly consumed by the attic. They kept measuring it. Over and over across multiple entries, they documented the dimensions of the attic space in obsessive detail, then compared those measurements to the footprint of the house below. And according to their calculations, something didn't add up. The attic was smaller than it should have been. There was a section along one of the walls, several feet of space that simply could not be accounted for by the rest of the house's layout. The math didn't work. From that point on, the entries zeroed in almost exclusively on that one wall. Every crack, every indent, every unusual mark or imperfection across its entire surface was documented with extreme precision. The writer cataloged every square inch of it as though they were trying to build an irrefutable case. And as the entries progressed, things grew more desperate. The writer was clearly spending hours at a time in the attic, returning again and again. Some entries suggested they were sleeping up there. They began hearing things from behind that wall. Scratching sounds, what they described as breathing, other noises that defied easy explanation. Certain entries even included timestamps, things like 2:14 a.m. Scratching, approximately 3 minutes in duration. The further I read, the more obvious it became that I was witnessing a first-hand account of someone's complete unraveling. The logic that held the early entries together had long since dissolved. The writing became fragmented and nearly incoherent, sentences giving way to disconnected phrases and then to something worse. The final pages weren't sentences at all, they were tally marks. Row after row after row of them, counting something I couldn't identify, something the writer either couldn't or wouldn't name. And then the entries simply stopped. Whether the person had stopped writing or whether that was just as far back as the record extended, I had no way of knowing. By the time I finished reading, my hands were shaking. I wanted to put everything back, climb down that ladder, and do my best to forget any of it had ever existed. But before I could make myself leave, I found my eyes drifting to the wall. The very wall the writer had been so relentlessly fixated on. And the moment I actually looked at it, really looked at it, I felt my stomach drop. There were marks on it, real ones, indentations and cracks that, when I moved closer and examined them carefully, seemed to correspond almost exactly with what the writer had been describing across dozens and dozens of pages. It was a different kind of frightening than anything I had encountered before. The only way I can describe it is the feeling of being watched, but from several directions at once. I could picture that person up in this same attic, in the dark, pressing themselves against that wall, clawing at it, scrawling their obsessions onto whatever paper they could find. It felt like they were still there somehow, like the attic still held them. I grabbed the black box and went straight downstairs to my dad. He was just as thrown off as I was. He had never seen the box before and had no idea what any of the contents meant. He told me with complete certainty that the handwriting wasn't his father's, which meant the person who wrote those entries must have lived in the house even before my grandfather. The problem was, both of his parents were gone and he knew virtually nothing about whoever had occupied the house before them. That trail had gone cold long ago. My dad decided he wanted to go up and take a look for himself, and to my surprise, he told me to come with him. I wasn't going to argue. Having him there made the attic feel significantly less threatening, so I followed him up and stood off to the side while he examined the wall, using some of the pages from the box as a reference. He studied it carefully for a few minutes, working his way methodically across the surface. Then he went still. He stood like that for a moment, clearly thinking. Then he turned to me and told me he was going to tear the wall down. I didn't argue with that either. He went to the garage, came back with tools, and he did exactly what he said he was going to do. He tore that wall down. What we found on the other side stopped both of us cold. The writer had been right. There was a hidden space back there, a significant one. It was several feet deep and it ran the entire length of the wall. The space was real, it was substantial, and it had been sealed off behind that surface for God knows how long. But that wasn't the worst part. The walls of the hidden space were covered in markings, black lines and symbols in shapes that neither of us recognized. They covered nearly every surface. The walls, every inch of available space. Whatever they were, they didn't look like writing. They didn't resemble any language or notation system I'd ever seen. They were something else, something I don't have the right word for even now. And the implication of what we were looking at only deepened the longer we stood there, because we soon realized something that made the whole situation significantly harder to process. There was no other entrance to that space, no door, no hatch, no gap in the structure. No alternative way in or out. It had been completely sealed on all sides, which raised a question neither of us could answer. How had anyone ever gotten in there in the first place? We stood in front of that opening for a long time, neither of us saying much. Eventually, once the initial shock had settled enough to think clearly, we confirmed that the space was empty. Nothing inside except whatever had been drawn across those walls. We took one last look and stepped back. But the more we thought about it, the less it made sense. And at some point, my dad raised something that hadn't occurred to me at all. He pointed out that whoever had written those notebooks, whoever had been consumed enough by this place to document every minute detail, to track scratching sounds by timestamp in the middle of the night, was not the kind of person who would then neatly gather all of their writings, carefully arrange them and tuck them away in a box in the corner. That level of compulsive, deteriorating behavior doesn't end with calm and tidy archival work. It just doesn't. I hadn't thought about it that way until he said it. But he was right, which meant someone else had collected those writings, someone else had found them, organized them, and stored them in that box. My dad went quiet after that. I watched something complicated move across his face, a mix of sadness and confusion that he clearly didn't have words for. After a long silence, he said it must have been his father. My grandfather must have found the writings at some point, gathered everything together, and sealed it all away in that box without ever telling anyone. Without ever saying a word about any of it. There wasn't much left to do or say after that. My dad admitted years later that his father choosing to keep something like that hidden, and whatever his reasons might have been for doing so, was something he'd never fully make peace with. I understand that completely. As for me, I'm honestly not sure what to make of any of it, even now. Enough time has passed that it doesn't occupy my mind the way it once did. But if I let myself sit with it long enough, it still gets to me. There's no rational explanation that covers everything. For a while, I told myself that whoever wrote those entries was also the one who had marked up the inside of that hidden space, and that they were simply a deeply disturbed individual who had come apart entirely. That was the version I could almost live with. But then I'd remember that some of what was written in those pages described things that could only have been known after that wall was already in place. Details about what was behind it. Details that no one could have known without having been inside that space. And with the wall sealed, there was no way inside. My dad wouldn't let me take the box when we eventually moved out of the house. For all I know, it's still sitting up there in that attic right now, tucked into a corner and waiting for someone else to find it. This is a mystery I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. I've been a smoker for longer than I'm proud of, 23 years now, give or take. At this point, it stopped being a habit in any meaningful sense and become something closer to a ritual. Something to occupy my hands or to mark the quiet end of a long day. The one rule I've always kept, the one I inherited from my parents without ever being told to, is that smoking happens outside. My dad smoked cigars on special occasions, and even he never did it indoors. That boundary was simply understood. I inherited this house from my parents about 4 years ago when they finally committed to the retirement move down to Florida they'd been discussing for years. I think they needed to know the house would land in good hands before they could actually bring themselves to leave. The timing worked out for me. I was divorced, living alone in an apartment that felt both too small and too depressing to stay in much longer, so taking over the family home made sense. My only real complaint since moving in is that the house feels too large for one person, which sounds like a strange thing to complain about until you consider that it's a 3-story colonial and I am its sole occupant. It also comes with a backyard that stretches nearly an acre if you include the wooded section at the far end. Sometime after moving in, I developed the habit of taking slow, late-night walks out there while I smoke. There's something genuinely peaceful about it. No neighbors close enough to notice or care. No ambient light except what spills from the house itself. Just me and the crickets and whatever small things are moving around in the trees. I usually complete a full loop around the property line, which takes roughly 10 minutes at a leisurely pace. It's become my version of winding down, I suppose, or maybe just my most convincing excuse to smoke without anyone watching. There are a few things worth knowing about the house itself before I get into what happened. The house is very old. It has all the characteristics you'd expect from something that's been standing as long as it has. Floors that creak under the lightest step, windows that let the cold in during winter, all of it. It's practically impossible to move through the house without producing some kind of sound. Every room, every hallway, every staircase announces your presence whether you want it to or not. The attic is accessed through a pull-down ladder in the upstairs hallway. It's a large open storage space, nothing particularly unusual about it, and I treat it the same way most people treat attics. As a place to put things I don't need immediate access to but can't quite bring myself to get rid of. My parents' old belongings that I haven't figured out what to do with. Holiday decorations, that kind of thing. I go up there infrequently and without much enthusiasm. There's also a small window up there, original to the house, maybe a foot wide, set into the wall that faces the backyard. It looks slightly out of place compared to the rest of the house's exterior, like an afterthought that was never fully integrated into the overall design. I've walked past it hundreds of times during my nightly loops through the backyard without ever giving it a second look. Until about 3 weeks ago. I was midway through a cigarette, doing my usual loop, not thinking about anything in particular. My eyes just drifted upward toward the house for no specific reason, the way your gaze sometimes wanders without any real intention behind it. And for a brief moment I could have sworn I saw something move behind that little attic window. I stopped walking and stood there in the middle of the backyard, staring up at it. The window was dark, which made sense since there's no permanent light source up there, but I was nearly certain I'd seen something. A shape passing across the glass maybe, or something shifting in the darkness just behind it. I stood there long enough to feel self-conscious about it, then told myself I was being irrational. A reflection of clouds moving across the sky, or a bat passing close to the glass. Something ordinary with an ordinary explanation. I finished my cigarette, went back inside and let it go. The following night I saw it again. This time I couldn't talk myself out of it. Whatever I had seen the night before as a possible trick of the light or a reflection was not what I was looking at now. Something was moving behind that window, something was in my attic. My first instinct was to blame an animal. Squirrels find their way into old houses all the time. A gap in the eaves, a loose board somewhere along the roofline, and suddenly you have a tenant you never agreed to. It wouldn't have surprised me. But the more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I became, because I started trying to think of what kind of animal would produce a shape visible from the distance I was standing at. And none of the answers I came up with were reassuring. I went inside, walked to the bottom of the stairs, and stood there looking up at the hallway where the attic ladder folds down. The house was completely silent. No scratching, no scurrying, none of the sounds you'd typically associate with a small animal moving around overhead. Just silence, which should have been comforting but wasn't. I didn't want to go up there. I want to be honest about that. I genuinely did not want to pull that ladder down and climb up into the dark, but if something had gotten into my attic, I needed to know about it. I needed to see it for myself. So I turned on my phone's flashlight, reached up and pulled the ladder down. The layout of the attic made the approach particularly nerve-wracking. The opening is positioned in such a way that you're essentially climbing up blind. You can't see what's waiting just beyond the hatch until your head is already level with the floor up there. If something had been lurking right at the opening, I wouldn't have known until it was too late to do anything about it. I climbed slowly, each rung feeling worse than the last, telling myself with very little conviction that everything was fine. I was not prepared for what I found. There was no animal. There was no person either, or at least not one I could immediately see. What there was instead was something that made no sense at all. The attic was destroyed. Not messy in the way a storage space gets messy over time, not just disorganized. Destroyed. Every box overturned, every bin emptied or knocked aside, everything in complete and total disarray. But I wasn't processing any of that, because the moment my flashlight swept across the walls, everything else stopped mattering. There was black paint smeared across every wall in the attic, every single one of them, including the ceiling. It was thick, almost chunky in the way it had been applied, like it had been put up with hands rather than a brush. Layered and heavy and deeply wrong-looking. And the worst part, the part that sent a cold shock through my entire body before I'd even fully registered what I was seeing, was that it was wet. Visibly, unmistakably wet, still dripping in places, the black liquid running in slow, thin lines down the walls. It had been done recently, minutes ago maybe. That first look nearly knocked me off the ladder. I don't entirely know how to explain the specific kind of fear that hit me in that moment. It wasn't just the mess or even the paint. It was the combination of everything. The destruction, the darkness, the slow drip of something black running down the walls of my home. That triggered something very primal. My brain went immediately to the worst available conclusion. There was someone in my house, someone who had broken in, come up to my attic, done this, and might still be up here with me right now. I swept the flashlight quickly across the whole space to confirm there was no one immediately visible, then got back down that ladder as fast as I safely could. The fear shifted into anger somewhere between the attic hatch and the ground floor. This was my house. My parents' house before that, and whoever had done this had violated it. I went to the kitchen, grabbed the largest knife I could find, and meant every bit of what I was planning to do with it. I cleared the house room by room, moving fast, checking every space large enough to conceal a person. Closets, bathrooms, behind doors, under beds. I went through every room on every floor and found nothing. No one. And the more I searched without finding anything, the more the adrenaline began to drain away and the fear started rushing back in to fill the space it left behind. I ended up back in my bedroom, trying to collect myself, convinced I must have missed something. Then in the brief silence after I stopped moving, I heard it. 2 heavy thumps, followed by what sounded like something substantial being dragged slowly across a floor, coming from directly above me. The attic. Of course, whoever was up there had never left. They'd been hiding behind the overturned boxes the entire time I was searching the rest of the house, waiting me out. I'm not sure where the next wave of courage came from. Maybe it was anger, maybe it was the simple refusal to be a prisoner in my own home. But something in me decided it was done being afraid. I went back upstairs, pulled the ladder down with one hand while gripping the knife in the other, and climbed. And I didn't climb quietly. I went up screaming, full volume, completely unhinged, knife out, making as much noise as I possibly could. Part of that was anger. Most of it, if I'm being honest, was terror wearing anger's clothing. I burst through the opening, yelling at the top of my lungs, stomped around, flipped boxes, searched every corner. I was absolutely certain someone was up there. But the attic was empty. I was sure of it this time. The space is one large open room with no real places of concealment once you've cleared the boxes. There was no one up there. What was up there, though, was something new. Something that hadn't been there during my first visit. Scratch marks, deep, long gouges carved into the wooden beams and floorboards, like an animal of considerable size had been clawing at every surface it could reach. The black paint was still there, still visibly wet in places, but now the scratches were layered over everything, crossing through the paint, cutting into the wood underneath. Looking at the combination of the two, the wet black smears and the deep claw marks running through them, was one of the most disturbing things I have ever seen inside a building I call home. That was it for me. I climbed back down, locked myself in the first-floor bathroom, and called 911. The police arrived about 15 minutes later. 2 officers went upstairs to check the attic while I waited on the ground floor with a third. When they came back down, their answer was the same one I dreaded hearing. The attic was empty. No one up there. And more importantly, they told me they couldn't find any gaps or points of entry anywhere in the attic structure. No broken boards, no open vents, no way in or out that shouldn't be there. Which meant whoever had vandalized the space had left through the house itself. Had to have come down through the same hatch I used and walked out through the front or back door. I told them that was impossible. I explained what I'd already explained to myself, that this house is so old and so structurally vocal that you cannot take a single step inside it without making noise. Not a single one. From where I had been standing on the floor below, I would have heard anyone moving through the house. I would have heard them. I heard nothing. The officers had no answer for that. There was nothing more they could do. They left and I was alone again. It's been 3 weeks since that night. Nothing further has happened. No more movement in the window, no more sounds from above. No more mornings that feel like the night before never fully ended. Things have been quiet, so I suppose the version of events I'm expected to accept is that a person, probably homeless, somehow found their way into the attic of my old house, vandalized it with black paint and their fingernails or something worse, and then slipped back out without making a single sound on floors that announce every footstep to everyone in the building. I don't believe that. I want to be clear about that. I've tried to believe it because it's the only explanation anyone has offered me, and it is technically possible in a way the alternatives are not. But I don't believe it. Not when I think about the sounds I heard after I'd already searched the house. Not when I think about how wet that paint was and what that implies about the timing. Not when I think about the scratch marks and what could have made them and how deep they went into the wood. I still haven't been back up there. Not to clean the paint, not for any reason. I'm not ready to open that hatch again and point my flashlight at those walls. I'm not sure when I will be or if I ever fully will be. What I do know is that the only explanation I've been given doesn't hold up, and I have nothing to replace it with. Whatever was in my attic that night, whatever I heard moving around above my bedroom ceiling after the house was supposed to be empty, I don't have a name for it, and I'm not entirely sure I want one.